I never expected to be involved in the Middle East. I never traveled to the Middle East until I was 27 years old. But when I finally met people from the Middle East, when I finally went there, when I saw what was happening, when I learned about the injustices, I knew I couldn't be silent. I knew I had to do something. My name is Tom Woodley. I visited the Middle East for the first time when I was in graduate school. I was about 24, 25 years old to do some volunteer work with Palestinian children in Israel, actually. And it was my first exposure to Israel, of course, first direct exposure to Israel, but of course working with Palestinian children in Israel proper. And it was quite an interesting experience. And I think in as much as Palestinian Israelis aren't quite as impacted as Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, there's certainly a sentiment of having been dispossessed in some way. And that was the first time I sort of heard new perspectives about Israel and its role and its practices and the policies of the government. Well, that experience gave me a heightened sense of interest in the Middle East. But I think what was important about that initial visit there to Israel-Palestine was a real sense of these are people just like us. With families, with feelings, you know, with ambitions just like us. And it got me interested in both peoples, Palestinian and Israeli, and more interested in better understanding what was going on there and why people believed what they did and thought what they did and said what they said. I started to be an activist starting in 2002. I have to admit it was somewhat through my wife, who was first became very angry at what happened in 2002 with what Israel calls their incursions into the West Bank. Some people call that the end of Oslo. Obviously, a lot of things changed in that spring and summer as Israel basically reinvaded portions of the West Bank that they had sort of stayed out of since the Oslo Accords. This is my wife, Grace Batchoun. She also happens to be my partner in activism. She's also, her official title is the VP of Public Relations with Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East.
When someone sent me an email telling me about a handicapped man in Jenin who was run over by an Israeli tank. And that's when I said, what? This is happening? Something has to be done. My first reaction was I wanted someone else to do something about it. What are others doing? Let's contact all the different organizations and see what they are doing. And we did. But after a couple of months, we came to the realization if we want something to happen, we've got to do it ourselves. So the first thing that we did, we went back to those organizations and we said, give us a project. Talk to us about an urgent need. And one of those organizations came with a project in Beni Naim, south of Hebron, where they had a cluster of 70 villages who used to depend on the emergency medical services of a hospital in Hebron. So they had the clinic, they had a small clinic, they had the doctors, but they did not have the equipment. And we were 3 people around the table, Tom, myself, and another person. And we said, how much? They said, 100,000. I said, we're doing it. The person next to me said, are you crazy? People in our community don't give money. You'd be lucky if you raise 5,000. And within not even 3 months, we raised $125,000 and we equipped a clinic in Beni Naim.
I think what we decided to do was we looked at what other organizations were doing, and we saw the importance of humanitarian work, but we really realized that a lot of what was going on was addressing the effect. There are core issues in the Middle East that weren't being addressed. Their effects were being addressed, but the actual core issues themselves, the injustices, and the political reasons for the injustices weren't being addressed. So we wanted to establish an organization that would really get to the core of the political issues on that. And you know, to some degree, your constituency for something like that, your constituency, okay, let's all feel good and let's all donate money to help these children in these dispossessed area. It's a whole lot harder to mobilize people and say, you need to talk to your elected representatives. We need to change the position of our government vis-a-vis this conflict on the other side of the world. It's quite a different game. And it's much more difficult, I find, to rally people to your cause and mobilize people around that. Canada has traditionally had a very positive reputation on the international front. We've intervened positively in the past in the Middle East. I think traditionally, at least with the Palestine-Israel conflict, both sides viewed Canada as a party that was willing to represent the interests of both sides in that conflict. That started to change, and started to change in, I'd say, not just the most recent government, but the previous government. So the 2 governments that formed by the 2 major parties in Canada both started to shift that policy somewhat. And I would say, by and large, it's because of domestic political concerns, unfortunately, in that you have, I think, forces within Canadian society which are working to create a type of pro-Israel lobby that's as strong and powerful in Canada as it is in the United States. I think Canadian society, however, over the long term will reject that. I think Canadian society is extremely cosmopolitan, extremely open-minded and broad-minded, and I think the key in Canada is to just keep informing people, make sure people understand better what's going on. Now that doesn't change necessarily something in the corridors of power, that you still need to access the corridors of power, whether it be political power or media power. But I think Canadians will respond, and Canadian policymakers will respond if we provide enough information and show that we're numerous enough that politicians have to listen to us.
Obama arrives in Japan today on the last stop of his 10-day Asia tour. Obama will attend the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit amidst a dispute.
So we're here at the CJPME Leadership Retreat. We're doing this because we want to inculcate a sense of leadership and vision for leadership within CJPME. The strategy for the retreat is around the theme of CJPME strengths and gaps, and the focus of this weekend will be looking at what we do well and looking at how we can enhance our strengths and then close some of those gaps that we have in our operation. And so training volunteers and giving them a consistent message, calling up members of parliament, getting them to agree to meet with us. And so from the very beginning we were quite ambitious because very few organizations actually in Canada do that.
CJPME is a unique organization, I think, in Canada because it's nonpartisan. There are all ethnic groups, all faith groups in our movement. We're pro-justice rather than pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. So I think it provides a space for people who wish to be active in this and see justice achieved.
Right now we have a conservative government that is very much pro-Israel, and I think it's important to have an organization that promotes peace and the law, I mean international law in the Middle East.
Because there's a lot of negative stereotypes on Arabs and Middle Easterns in Canada, and the fact that an organization like CGPME can break these boundaries and can show like, hey, you know what, Arabs and Middle Easterns can make a difference as well, and we are active members in the world rather than destructive.
We expanded our mission about 2.5 years ago to also say, to empower Canadians to speak out on these issues on the Middle East and how they relate to things going on in Canada. So that if you have a demonstration for a ceasefire in Lebanon, that if someone in the media calls that, well, you were demonstrating in support of terrorism, we can say no. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with foreign policy, but no, these are Canadians demonstrating for a ceasefire, and you can't brand them as supporting a terrorist organization. They're supporting peace. I was born in New York, but spent most of my childhood and adolescence in the state of Indiana. Very ethnically homogeneous, so very little exposure to outside cultures. You know, typical American. You know, everyone spoke the same, everyone had the same lifestyle, culture, habits, religion for the most part. So a very, very sort of protected environment. I was working for the U.S. federal government, had a very, very high-paying and interesting job with the U.S. federal government in Washington, D.C. But I met my wife, who was living in Montreal, and we carried on a long-distance relationship for 2 years. This was before the days of email, so we actually wrote letters and things like that. And I eventually moved up here in 1995 to get married to my wife, and I've been here ever since, became a Canadian citizen, I think, in 1998.
We do speaking tours 4 or 5 times a year. I think Dr. Baghouti is perhaps the most important speaker we've brought to Canada. We have had other prominent speakers, but he's probably the most prominent. There are several reasons that we do these types of events. On the one hand, obviously, we're trying to inform Canadians, bring more information to Canadians, new perspectives, especially from a Palestinian point of view.
Excellent, excellent. But he said it was 21 minutes, so you have to cut it down. Okay.
How are you? Good to see you.
Okay.
How are your interviews?
Very good.
Good. Excellent.
Dr. Mustafa Baghouti is a well-known Palestinian leader. We were actually working on bringing him for about 3 years. We first got in touch with him about 3 years ago, and there was interest on both sides, but it just took several years to work it all out.
4th question. Do you think there will be...
تقليديا كانت مواقف كندا متوازنة أكثر في الماضي، وكان لكندا دور هام مثلا في دعم وكالة الغوث ومساعدة الفلسطينيين بأشكال مختلفة، ولكن الوضع تغير بصورة حادة منذ قدوم حكومة المحافظين إلى الحكم في كندا. ولكن طبعا ما يساعدنا ويشجعنا وجود أشخاص مثل توم وأصدقائه الذين عبر التجربة وعبر تعرفهم على القضية الفلسطينية أصبحوا من أشد المناصرين لنا، لأنهم يؤمنوا بالعدل ويؤمنوا بمبدأ السلام الحقيقي القائم على العدل ويؤمنوا بحق الشعوب في الحرية.
So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Abir.
Good evening, everybody. I'm finally here.
It was all set up for the end of March that he was to come and he was to do certain cities, and everything was all set. And the Canadian government really dragged its heels in terms of granting Dr. Barghouti his visa to Canada. They gave him the visa the day after he was supposed to get on a plane to come here. So rather than sort of having him come here and do only a third of what we had planned for him to do, we sort of said, no, let's do this right. Let's reschedule it. Let's make it right. Many may not be aware that the Canadian government over the past 6 months had actually denied entry to many people. George Galloway, a British MP who's active on the Middle East causes, and many others had been denied visas to Canada. So we saw this obviously as part of a pattern, part of a ploy on the part of the Canadian government to limit the dialogue or to prevent the dialogue that's so important on these issues.
Yesterday I told people in Ottawa a story about a Palestinian peasant. He had 26 barrels of oil that he was going to the market with to sell. And then he was stopped at an Israeli checkpoint. And the Israeli military told him, step out of your bus or truck and we will let you pass if you curse yourself, your people, and your religion. And the man refused. So they told him, if you don't do that, we will destroy your product. And they started to throw on the ground a barrel of oil each time. And they kept asking him the same question, and he kept refusing, till they destroyed the 26 barrels of oil. So he went back home with nothing. But he didn't curse. And what astonished him, that when he got home, he found 26 barrels of olive oil standing in front of his house, because the people of the village watched what was going on, understood what was going on, and they were all in solidarity with him. That is
We get a lot of very strong feedback. I think anything other than positive comes from, I think, people for whom we're a threat. And that could be the established pro-Israel organizations in Canada that would prefer that we not be active on the issues that we're speaking out on. I risk being labeled all sorts of different things just because I speak out for justice and peace for Palestinians and for all peoples of the Middle East. So I risk being accused of some terrible things, as do many others. You don't have to be a member of CJPME to be accused of being an anti-Semite, and there are members of parliament that get accused of being against Israel or in some way anti-Semitic. Partly because it's a strategy to close off dialogue. If the other side can prevent people from speaking honestly and intelligently and in an informed manner on these issues, then essentially they win.
The United States
bias you'll see in Canadian mainstream media would be along the lines of, how many articles give voice to this perspective versus how many articles give voice to that perspective. And that's why it's been so refreshing to have Al Jazeera English enter the Canadian market, because they are going to give all perspectives on these issues.
Thomas Woodley is a policy analyst with Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East.
We were very excited when we learned last year that Al Jazeera English had applied to broadcast in Canada, and we better understood what it is that Al Jazeera, how would Al Jazeera be helped in their application. And our strategy basically was, again, to mobilize Canadians of all backgrounds to get involved in supporting Al Jazeera English's bid at the CRTC, Canada's broadcast regulator. And so we developed a tool whereby any Canadian could actually submit a letter to the CRTC in support of Al Jazeera's bid to broadcast. And we sent that tool out to all of our adherents, which numbers about 20,000 right now. And we had actually thousands of people that responded and actually followed our step-by-step procedure to actually submit letters to the CRTC. So ultimately, my understanding is that the response in support of Al Jazeera English last year to the CRTC was one of the most overwhelming responses in favor that they've ever had from the public. I would like a society where there aren't these taboos, where there aren't things that you can't say, that you don't get your person attacked because you hold a particular viewpoint on something. So this is the society that we need, is a society where there is open dialogue, whatever the question may be. Democracy is a very fragile thing. I didn't realize how fragile it was until I got involved. And unless Canadians get involved and hold their politicians accountable, the politicians will abuse the power that we give to them. And we've got to challenge that as Canadians.